Here he would have seen the Chinese fishing nets imported in Mongol times, for Indian merchants had long traded with China from here, exchanging pepper and spices for porcelain and silk. From Cochin, Zheng He explored East Africa and visited the Persian Gulf and Mecca itself. He could have discovered the West had he had the inclination. It would be nearly a century before Vasco da Gama sailed into this same harbour, not as a bearer of peace, but a harbinger of war and conquest. Then, suddenly, the imperial bureaucrats banned any further voyages, despite their rich commercial potential. The ships were broken up, their logbooks destroyed, and now only a few stone inscriptions on a wind-swept hillside remain to speak of one of the great mysteries of history. Western thinkers have always taken a brutally simple line on the stopping of Zheng He's explorations. For them, it would be like calling a halt to manned space exploration on the eve of the first moon landing. It's proof that the Chinese are backward-looking and ignorant, had no desire for new knowledge, and were run by a load of hidebound bureaucrats. Proof, too, that the West was the fount of science and technology and progress and had a monopoly on the spirit of enterprise. But as always in history, there are many ways of looking at the same question. After all, it was the Chinese who were the great technological innovators. So perhaps it's really a question of how different civilizations think you should use technology. And perhaps then the Chinese saw, quite sensibly on the face of it, that their true interests lay here, inside their own borders, cultivating their soil, cultivating the inner life, searching for the harmony that had always been the goal of their civilization. And that it was the West, on the other hand, that had a compulsive desire to change, a compulsive need to invade other people's space, both moral and physical, and a refusal to accept limits on its own. Since the 18th century, it's been customary to talk about the East needing to catch up with the West. These days, that's obviously happening all around us, materially, if it's not happened already. But it takes two to make a dialogue. And perhaps the West still has some catching up to do. Perhaps the West still has to learn from the East a way of cultivating its inner space, of accepting limits on desires and space in an increasingly finite world. At the beginning of this modern dialogue between the East and the West, the French philosopher Pascal said that the trouble with Western man was this: he did not know how to be content in an empty room. The banning of the Ming voyages was part of a deeper introspection in Chinese culture. Now, behind a new Great Wall to keep out the barbarians, the Chinese built a new capital far to the north, Beijing, the North City. Here at the altar of heaven, the emperor continued to perform the rituals of the Bronze Age, in the belief that the world would never change. The longest and richest intellectual tradition in the world, now increasingly turned in on itself. And here in the National Library in Beijing is the most staggering proof both of that greatness and of its progressive desiccation. This is the greatest literary enterprise of all time. An encyclopedia running to 79,000 handwritten volumes, still in its original shelves and boxes, labelled in green, red, blue and grey, according to the imperial cataloguing system of spring, summer, autumn and winter, for classics, history, philosophy and literature. A testimony to the idea that all knowledge, past, present and future, could be contained in a single room.
But all this time, far away in barbarian Europe, Bacon, Newton, Descartes had been concerning themselves not with how to perfect the past, but how to control the future. And now some Chinese intellectuals began to plead for a more open approach to knowledge. Among them, an obscure young historian called Chang Hsüeh-cheng.
It was Chang Hsüeh-cheng, on the very eve of the most momentous upheaval in Chinese history since the time of the Qin emperor, in other words, the clash with the West, and all that that would engender. It was he who attempted to reappraise the way that the Chinese had seen history since the very beginnings of the Confucian tradition. For him, history was an all-embracing concept which would include all of this, the entire canon of Chinese literature. The Confucian texts, he said, were all history. Confucius may be a true guide to life, but he is also simply a historical text, and the time is past when history should be merely minute textual analysis and compilation by squads of scholars burrowing away on a rigid and old-fashioned curriculum. History should be dynamic and meaningful. Some have seen him as a precursor of the revolution, a prophet of democracy, an enemy of feudalism. That's no doubt exaggerated. But in 1799, 2 years before his death, he wrote a prophetic letter about what he saw as the inevitable decline of the Qing dynasty and the worrying prospects ahead. This was a time, he said, when history should no longer concern itself merely with the past, but should use the past to reform the present and indeed to look into the future. And the historian's greatest gifts, he said, were not just knowledge, but inspiration and insight. And a historian's inspiration, he thought, was just like the I Ching, the Book of Changes, in that it enabled him to look into the future. At the moment of his death, China was about to come face to face with another culture whose view of history was diametrically opposed to that of the Chinese tradition. The Europeans, with their Judeo-Christian heritage, believed that history was purposive, that it was leading towards an appointed end, and that they would be the winners.
The first Chinese descriptions of we Westerners are not flattering. These barbarians have a grim look, untidy hair, an unpleasant smell. They have no rituals worthy of the name. They're liars and are rather arrogant. They conquer countries by fraud and force, ingratiating themselves in a friendly way before they oppress the natives. At the heart of their conduct is violence. By the 18th century, the coasts of the South China Sea were frequented by the Spanish, the Dutch, Portuguese, English, and later Americans. All bearing Chinese inventions: gunpowder, the stern rudder, the magnetic compass, paper maps. Coming not just to sell, but to impose their goods, their ideas, their religion, their will. They soon set up trading colonies, lauding it from grand mansions paid for by the illicit trade in goods like opium. In the tale of colonial infamy, this is one of the least known episodes in the West.